So just like we saw all of that industrialization in the north because of new technologies, we're going to see a little bit of technology really impact the south in a way that's just as important and just as massive. So in the same year that Samuel Slater invented the textile mill, this guy, Eli Whitney, invents something that is going to really transform the entire South, which is called the cotton gin. Gin, that's how you spell gin, the cotton gin. So this machine right here, this wooden thing, this is what the cotton gin is. So if you've ever, or if you haven't ever handled real raw cotton before, it's pretty sticky, and the fibers, they're all together. It's pretty stiff, and there's seeds in it, which can be very difficult to pull apart, and sometimes thorns get wrapped up in there. It can be really tough on your hands. So by hand processing cotton can take quite some time. Pulling it all apart and pulling the seeds out and everything is really difficult. So what Eli Whitney has done is he's created a machine that will do it for you. So you see this this thing right here. This is actually a comb, like a metal comb with these metal teeth sticking up, and you stretch the cotton across it, and you close this, and you turn this crank, and it pulls the cotton through this metal comb, which in turn pulls out all of the seeds and separates the cotton. So doing this makes processing cotton so much faster, really making it a incredibly profitable and useful tool. Now, unfortunately for Eli Whitney, it's actually really a simple machine, and it's really easy to recreate. So you see here, there's some slaves using the cotton gin, just pulling all this cotton while this guy, turns this crank and pulls out all this processed cotton. Eli Whitney never makes any money off of it because it's so easy to make. It's really easy. A lot of farmers just make their own and they copy it. So he never really does anything. But what happens here is that Eli Whitney, spurs a boom in the cotton industry in the South. So the cotton industry is actually going to help fuel that textile industry in the North. So we're going to see this interdependence. The North and the South, while their economies are going to be very, very different, we've got the North is all about industry and the South is all about agriculture. The two of them are going to go hand in hand. They're really going to rely on each other. Great Britain also imports large amounts of cotton from the South after its Industrial Revolution. So the South is supplying all of the cotton to the United States North as well as Great Britain, and then they are turning it into manufactured textiles and goods, which are being sold all over the world. So without the South's supply, the North would be hurt, and without the North's demand, the South would be hurt. So the two are really reliant on each other. Now, what's interesting here is how big cotton becomes. We call it king cotton. It is the king crop of all agriculture in the South. So you can see here the population, the slave population is what this map is, and then this is cotton production. And you see where all the red is, it was similar before. There was it was a lot more spread out early on, but then you begin to see it move and eventually shift into this, where you see the most populated areas are this red, which is sort of goes as a line right here, and it follows this line, and that is, slaves that are living on cotton plantations. We actually call this line here the cotton belt. So it's funny because Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin to reduce the amount of labor necessary to process cotton. If you can use this crank, it takes less slaves to produce the same amount of cotton. So he was actually trying to decrease the amount of slave labor required to process and produce cotton, but it ends up having the total opposite effect. And people think, well, now that I've gotten the cotton gin, and it takes me so much less time and less money to make cotton, I can take the profit now that I've made off cotton and I can buy more slaves, and they can make me more cotton, and then that will make me more money, and then I can buy more slaves, and the process just goes on and on and on and on. And cotton is going to become the United States' largest and most valuable export until the end of the century, until 1900. Out of everything, not just crops, but everything that we make in the United States, this is going to be the biggest one, and this is going to be the most valuable one. So cotton, is really going to be running the United States, which means that slavery is really going to be running the United States until the end of the century. So you see here the distribution of population, it's really becoming a lot more populated on this cotton belt line that we've got here. So this is why we consider slavery to be the foundation of the Cotton Kingdom. So even though slavery, the international slave trade, right, had been banned in 1808, that means that we're not having any more slaves coming into the United States from Africa or the Caribbean or anywhere else. Does that mean slavery is going to die out? No, it doesn't. Just because we don't have any more slaves coming in doesn't mean that all the slaves are going to get old and die and then there's not going to be any more slaves. It just means that the only slaves that we've got now are slaves that are people that are being born into slavery immediately. And that is going to, that's just going to happen more and more and more. The generations are going to get larger and more people are going to be born into slavery. By 1810, it's a massive amount. By 1810, we have 1 million slaves in the United States. By 1840, in just 30 more years, that grows to 2.5 million slaves, which is a ridiculous amount of people. In the South, African Americans, which in the South is pretty much just slaves, that accounts for 1/3 of the total population. Now, I know a lot of people have in their minds, that every person in the South owned a slave, and that every person in the South who owned a slave owned like 100, right? Everyone lived on a giant plantation and had like 100 slaves. That could not be further from reality. In reality, only about 1/4 of people in the United States, or even in the South, owned slaves. Only about 25% of people in the South owned slaves. And the people who did own slaves owned very few, for the most part. Obviously, there are large plantations, like we talked about, cotton plantations, like the type of thing you'd see in the movie 12 Years a Slave or Django Unchained or something like that. That is a rare situation, though. There are plenty of those places, but most people in the South are not that. Most people in the South don't even have slaves. The few that do have less than 10. If you look at this map, this says slaves per owner. Everything that is blue, green, or yellow, that is where people have less than 11 slaves. The only areas where they have between 11 and 63 is the pink by the time we get to 1860. So and the reason for that is because slaves are expensive. If you were going to buy a healthy, young, strong male in between the ages of 18 and 20, that would probably cost you in today's dollars maybe up to $35,000, $40,000, which is very expensive, and not everyone could buy slaves on credit. So anyone who bought slaves had to be fairly wealthy. So that means most people who had slaves were, they would own less than 5, and they were on, family farms. Their family would work alongside the slaves. Obviously, in most cases, that didn't mean that they were treated a whole lot better than slaves on big plantations, where big plantations was really sort of the worst case scenario for a slave. Where they were sort of treated like, cogs in a machine, just sort of pieces of the puzzle. We're going to see this institution of slavery is really going to grow because of the cotton gin, where slavery, like I said a minute ago, more slaves equals more cotton equals more money, and the cycle just continues. Now, cotton isn't the only, crop out there that relies on slave labor. We also have sugar cane, sugar beets, tobacco, rice, lots of different things that require slave labor. So by the time we get to 1840, though, the Southern economy is totally reliant on agriculture, and that means that this Southern economy is totally reliant on slavery, which means that even if you don't have a slave, or even if you don't know anyone who has a slave in the South, if you live in a place that doesn't have slaves, or if maybe you live in a coastal town and you own a bookstore, you are still relying on slavery because your customers, their income comes from slavery. Or maybe they own businesses also, but their customers come from slavery. Somehow the root of all of this money, it traces back to slavery. So the South is becoming totally reliant on the institution of slavery, economically speaking, which we're seeing, because of that, this agriculture is going to become, the only thing happening in the South, while we've got all of this industry and boom in the North. This doesn't mean the North, views necessarily slavery as morally reprehensible. They just don't need it the way that the South needs it, or at least the way that the South thinks they need it. So we've got a lot of stark differences here between the North and the South. The North and the South are quickly becoming two very different places. So in the North, we've got Industry is what the economy is all about. In the South, it's all about agriculture. In the North, we've got, progress and change and technology and new inventions. When in the South, it's really about tradition, and technology isn't going to be that important because there's slave labor. We don't need a new machine to make this process easier because we can just make a slave do it. Now once they've got the cotton gin, that's pretty much all they need. The culture in the South is going to be much less diverse because the North is where all the immigrants are porting to. So we've got a large immigrant population in the North contributing to a very diverse culture, when in the South, it's pretty much just white people and slaves. That's essentially the whole culture of the South. Obviously, there are some immigrants, but it is a few and far between type of situation. The South is growing more and more reliant on slavery by the day, while the North is growing less and less reliant on slavery by the day. So these two places are really totally different institutions.